Next up, the U.S. Drought Monitor shows the majority of Nebraska with at least a moderate level of drought. The dryness is making it difficult for producers who have forage management decisions this spring. Market Journal's Bill Dodd caught up with Extension Range and Forage Specialist Jerry Volesky to find out more about grazing and forage management during and after drought.
It's never too early to start thinking about your plans for the upcoming growing season, especially if you've been impacted by drought conditions in the previous year. Plant production in Nebraska rangelands are dictated by multiple weather-related factors. As such, there are a number of key variables producers should keep in mind when cultivating their strategy.
But some of the key things should be things like the projected cattle numbers or stocking rates we're going to use this coming season, as well as the possibility of an extended period for feeding hay. Also, thinking about the level of utilization on our pastures last year, possible culling and weaning strategies, and a pasture use sequence that we might use if we have multiple pasture rotations. Another thing I think one can keep in mind is, with the producer experiences and decisions they made last year when we had some drought conditions, that they could have a look at those and see what worked for them and possibly bring those back and keep those fresh in their minds. For those producers that use multiple pasture rotations, and whether it's just simply like 4 different pastures that they rotate through across the growing season, one very important concept with that is that each year we certainly encourage the managers to change up the sequence that they use those 4 different pastures. So in other words, making sure that they're not grazing the same pasture the same time each year. So if it's grazed in June last year, it might be grazed later in the summer this coming year.
If you have been dealing with drought conditions, you know all too well what the telltale signs of drought look like. However, the long-term impacts should be what you're focused on. One thing that can be particularly damaging when going through drought conditions is overgrazing.
Well, sure. As far as the effect or response of our pastures and rangelands to drought, it's pretty obvious with, of course, with that lack of precipitation. We have significantly reduced plant growth as well as root growth, and that also affects the reproductive ability of these grasses. So sometimes these droughty years will see lingering effects into subsequent years where there's just poor pasture production. We may have, depending on the severity of drought, some actual death loss of some of the grasses. So then we'll have thinner stands and overall less productivity. And so something that is very important, we like to think that our grazing management is always on top of things, but inevitably under drought conditions, we tend to overgraze somewhat. And that combination of overgrazing and the drought can really negatively impact our grasses into the future.
While some producers may be able to rely on carryover forage, unfortunately, due to last year's drought conditions, another obstacle many producers will have to plan accordingly for is the reduced stock of carryover forage from previous seasons.
Sure, and that's very important, the carryover forage. And we can think back or go back to the pretty severe drought, of course, of 2012. But prior to 2012, so that'd be in 2011, 2010, we had some couple of really wet years, and we had a lot of grass production those years before the drought. And then during the drought, many ranchers were lucky to have that carryover forage from the previous years. And certainly, of course, the quality of that forage isn't the best being carried over, but nonetheless, it was some forage. And so as we go into this year, and if we do have dry conditions, keep in mind that most of our pastures last year were a bit more heavily grazed than we would like to see. And so they're not going to have that luxury of that abundance of carryover forage in the pastures.
Overall, in terms of a drought management plan, one thing many producers will place an emphasis on are critical or trigger dates. However, as precipitation rates vary for different pasture and rangeland types and locations across the state, Critical date plans and actions can often take several years of records to fine-tune that plan for an individual operation.
And these are dates where one evaluates their total local precipitation up to that date. So on May 1st, for example, they could determine what their total spring precipitation was up to that date and compare it to the long-term average for the year. They certainly, of course, might also want to consider last fall's precipitation and how much soil moisture was there going into the winter months. But with that critical date of May 1st, for example, if their precipitation totals are significantly lower or below the averages, that could trigger a choice of several possible management actions, such as an extended period of feeding hay or culling some livestock. And these actions can account for varying levels of drought.
In these dry conditions, livestock forage demand will more often than not exceed available plant production, leaving producers to make some incredibly hard decisions. With the uncertainty the weather can bring, it's certainly a good idea to have a grazing and forage management plan in place during and after a drought. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.